Robert P. Fitton is a prolific author. His Patch Kincaid series burrows into the timeline of the 1960s, deep into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King's death in Memphis, and Senator Robert F. Kennedy's murder at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Mr. Fitton's talk today is entitled, "A 12-Year-Old Boy Becomes Part of the Kennedy Assassination."
I want you to travel back with me to Friday in late November 1963. I was 12 years old, standing in the crisp autumn light in Massachusetts. Along with the rest of the world, I am collapsing into grief, but I was only 12 years old. I always liked politics, and if you like politics in the early 1960s, you probably like John F. Kennedy. I've often recounted my staying up long after my parents had gone to bed on Election Eve 1960 to see if Kennedy won. The count went on until early morning. I went to bed, and when I woke up, JFK was president. The evening paper, the Brockton Enterprise, arrived in the afternoon with a huge color photo of President-elect Kennedy on the front page. I had no idea what had just hit me. However, on that afternoon in 1963, it was worse than anything that had ever hit me, and I just didn't know why. I lived in a world of flat-top haircuts. I used Vitalis hair tonic in my hair. And speaking of hair, the Beatles had not yet traveled to the United States. I bought my first Elvis record, Return the Sender. I constructed my first book, 87 pages on the North Central states, complete with colorful brochures from the states. I took a girl to a square dance and enjoyed school dances once a month. Computers were just talked about in my little town on Massachusetts' South Shore. The Boston Red Sox hadn't won a pennant or a World Series forever. The New England Patriots were the Boston Patriots in the American Football League. Tom Brady was not yet born. Marilyn Monroe did a sexy shoot for Life magazine, and I won the home run competition for Little League in 1963. I had to wait sometimes to use the phone in my house, which was not called a landline, it was just the phone. My uncle had a microwave phone in his car used on construction sites. Nothing was digital, watches were analog, and you knew how to tell the time by the hands on the clock. It was the world of The Twilight Zone and Ed Sullivan. TV stations still used film because videotape was not prolific. Now Detroit was placing 2 headlights on cars, and we thought that was pretty cool. Nobody was doxxed. Parents could rely on other parents not to take any guff from kids. Discipline was something you learned. Drugs was something you took when you were sick. If people began yelling or swearing on TV, they would be banned or stations would be fined. There was something called the equal time provision, and I wish we had it back. Having equal time turns down the temperature. My parents had worked through the Great Depression, experienced death when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and remembered when World War II was still called the war. People were fed sometimes by neighbors, yet my parents got through all that. Maybe they had built up a resistance to national tragedies, or maybe they were just tough. That 12-year-old kid was not in denial on November 22nd, 1963. In fact, he's deeply saddened by the death of President John F. Kennedy, a man he admired, a man who brought us through the Cuban Missile Crisis, a man who sent the National Guard against Governor George Wallace, blocking blacks from matriculating in college. A man with the soaring rhetoric of Inauguration Day who asked us to remember what we could do for our country. On that bleak November afternoon, we were told to pray for his family, which I did. JFK was dead. Part 2. Lies, lies, and more lies. The world goes dark. Nietzsche said, "I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset because now I can't believe you." Keep that in mind. Lee Harvey Oswald, the loner, or was he, who worked in the Texas School Book Depository, scared me. I only knew what the media told me, but a friend's mother said Jack Ruby killed Oswald to shut him up. Really? Thinking like that was the world of Robert Stack and the Untouchables or crime shows on TV, something so far removed from the America I grew up in. In the future, as I became older, I could deeply understand how the assassinations of the 1960s so radically changed the attitudes, the hope, and the optimism of the future, and belief in the United States. Kennedy said it himself on that cold day in Washington in January 1960. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will truly light the world. Well, the world went dark after he was killed, and it hasn't come back. I trusted what the leaders of our country and the media told me. I bought the Associated Press's book on the Warren Report and read it. The most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, broadcast in Oswald was a lone nut documentary. I grew up in a world where justice for all was in the Pledge of Allegiance that I recited every morning in school. Johnny Carson once hosted a game show called Who Do You Trust? Now I wondered just who I trusted. On November 22nd of every year, the grief was like a sudden returning tide. But then I would get up and go on growing up and doing the things that teenagers do. I wanted Senator Robert F. Kennedy to assume the presidency. I admired Dr. King's resolve and quest for justice. But like my parents, living through national tragedies, I moved on when King and Kennedy were killed. Yet President Kennedy's influence was part of my consciousness. I was an area coordinator for a congressional candidate against the Vietnam War, and later volunteered for Sergeant Shriver's campaign when I was at the University of Massachusetts. Part 3. The revisionist accumulates evidence. Then I heard another shot, which hit him right in the head, over there, and his head practically opened up, and a lot of blood and many other things came out. Abraham Zapruder. Let's drop into UMass's guest lecture series in the 1970s. Now in my 20s, I would be able to see the Zapruder film of the assassination shown by Mark Lane. As I walked into the hall, I believed that Lane was some kind of crazy man. I had watched Bill Buckley tear him apart on firing line. The lights dimmed, and I then watched in horror what I had not seen on that afternoon in 1963. The color film was a stark representation of murder. I again thought about President Kennedy while he was alive. What truly stunned me was the president's head snapping back on film. Wait a minute. Oswald was supposed to be in back of the limo. Everything had changed for me right there. I no longer thought that Lane was crazy. How could all these authority figures have it wrong? Well, they did. Although I didn't have the grief of the 12-year-old boy, I was equally stunned by what I had witnessed. A couple of years later, when the United States House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassination, the HSCA, was formed in the middle 1970s, I set up my reel-to-reel recorder and recorded as much of what I could get of direct testimony of people I'd only read about in books since the Mark Lane Zapruder screening. But I always thought back to that afternoon in November as I tried to reconstruct my knowledge of the Kennedy assassination, as if I were rehabbing a house. And I still asked why. In the early 1960s, in grade school, I knew about communist Cuba and the flamboyant and base Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev. Castro with his cigar was a distinct figure. I was aware of the conflict in Southeast Asia. I made remarks that I hoped that Johnson would never become president. I had a scant knowledge of the CIA and Army intelligence, but never thought cops might not be on the up and up. The FBI was the gold standard. At the age of 27, I began writing books. That will become more important in a few moments. My library of the Kennedy assassination books was growing, but I was pessimistic if JFK's assassination would ever be solved. The Mafia's connection to the assassination contrasted with RFK's war on organized crime. I dug deeper with the zeal of a 12-year-old boy who had been lied to about something hugely important. I began to understand the Bay of Pigs, CIA's role in the misguided hostility against President Kennedy by the anti-Castro Cubans. The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. President John F. Kennedy. In the 1990s, I wrote a book called Redshift that outlines the Bay of Pigs invasion and how that was one of the factors in developing the plot against President Kennedy. I also wrote about some of the players in the middle of what was obviously a plot in the Kennedy assassination. Because Patch Kincaid, Jim Cahill, went back in time, JFK was assassinated. Redshift was the extent of my writing about the Kennedy assassination. Later I was able to put that piece of the puzzle in the Kennedy paradox, sourced and unfiltered, and into the plot against the president. Occam's razor and a reasonable look at the simplicity of research. Learning about the life of Lee Harvey Oswald changed my thinking to the simplest explanation and backing up Occam's razor with source material. There was more to Oswald than just the Warren Commission's patsy. Documents were released from the AARB, and it called into question intelligence connections with Oswald. How Oswald had worked the radar on the X-15 spy plane out of Atsugi, Japan. How he had defected to Russia under the fake defector program. He worked in conjunction with George Joannides of the CIA when he played a double agent role in handing out pro-Castro pamphlets in New Orleans and pretending to be a Marxist on the radio. And witnesses matter. Witnesses never interviewed by the Warren Commission, or witnesses whose testimony had been changed or distorted. Witnesses who never saw Oswald on the stairs running to the first floor. Witnesses that saw Oswald in the lunchroom on the first floor of the depository. It was filling a subconscious need of that 12-year-old boy to find out the reasons for the president's death. In my notes were hundreds of assertions and trails of evidence. It was time to revise and deepen my book, Redshift. I constructed an extensive bibliography so I could answer the early question of why. 5. Sharpening the lens, improving it page by page. It was time for Patch to return to Dallas. Argument by justification is a mortal sin when investigating the Kennedy assassination. It's an easy game forged by bias, empathy, and implied information and lies. It's all over the place, from Dallas to Atsugi. I had listened to a lie by the anti-Castro Cuban Antonio Veciana, who claimed Lee Harvey Oswald met Maurice Bishop, who was supposedly David Atlee Phillips, CIA's chief of the Western Hemisphere Division, at the Southland Building in Dallas, September 1963. Dr. John Newman swept in from the perspective of an intelligence analyst and proved Veciana a liar. I rewrote the entire chapter, adding verified Army intelligence in the plot against the president. I signed up for the Mary Ferrell site to access most of these important documents. In sum, there are 873 footnotes in my book, Return to Dallas, because the assassination is complex and laced with conjecture. There are so many influences or justifications of argument that people feel is true. Well, how fair is that? Part 6. But wait, there's more. There are 3 additional books in the Patch Kincaid series that bring the page count to well over 3,000 pages. When I first wrote Redshift, I never believed that I would span the decade with a series of source novels. I realized after a deep dive into the assassination that there was indeed more. The realization coincides with the Jim Garrison investigation. Patch goes forward into the 1960s, 1966-67. CIA formed a task force to shut down Garrison and added bribery and media complicity to the attack force. I made sure that I stuck to Occam's razor with sources. Vietnam is shown for the death trap that it was, and it's notated throughout the Patch series how it never would have happened had Kennedy lived. American Injustice, MLK, and RFK gets into the details of the political climate and the internationality of late 1967 and 68. Volume 4 brings the reader into the campaign of Senator Kennedy with the actual RFK speeches that spring in the audiobook. I could feel the momentum when Bobby started winning, and especially when he won the California primary. The death of Martin Luther King, again, searches for truth, backed up by a comprehensive bibliography. The audio from the Ambassador Hotel is very difficult to listen to. When combined with the plot, it makes sense, something the official investigation did not do. Part 7, Life After Patch. Patch Kincaid and Natalie Tompkins trying to solve the Kennedy assassination by possessing the De Gaulle report are killed in an explosion in France. So is Baker Finch from CIA. Time moves forward with Patch's mentor Ray Mankiewicz hiding from CIA with his best friend Phineas Beauregard on a farm in Vermont. Patch and Natalie are buried on that farm. A brilliant descendant of Patch Kincaid and her friends appear from the future. Her name is Amanda Zimmerman, and she will solve the Nixon theorem, which states that President Nixon did or did not do something that allowed the rise of the perfectus. The perfectus is not human and targets humans in the future. Amanda, in a complex plot, solves the Nixon theorem. Part 8. The 12-year-old boy is called to Dallas. I felt a strong connection with the past the day I received an unexpected email from Dallas, Texas, requesting that the Patch Kincaid series be archived at the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, and would I agree to a Zoom and perhaps a live oral history interview. The museum is located in the sandstone-faced building where the Texas School Book Depository was once housed. I never dreamed when I was walking home so long ago in the autumn light after Kennedy was shot that I would be flying to Love Field where Jack and Jackie landed on that fateful day, where the president's body was brought back to Bethesda. I entered the museum, the actual building which was the center of the assassination speculation in Dallas, where Lee Harvey Oswald worked. Now I would be part of the oral history, sharing my work in a film interview with the curator of the museum. Speaking about 3,000 pages plus extemporaneously was a bit overwhelming. I felt like the ancient mariner compelled to tell the story. And I did tell it for an hour and 15 minutes. It's now posted on the museum's site under the oral history program. Part 9. My life lessons because of the Kennedy assassination. I learned at age 12 something that I took with me all of my life. You never expect that out of tragedy. I know that some things are final. No matter how optimistic one might be, you can get through the pain and the hurt with the same energy, faith, and devotion that JFK spoke about. Power tends to be preserved at any price. People lie. People think they're right and they can thrust their beliefs on the rest of us. But I also learned how much Americans cared for President Kennedy. Even after all these years, they admire what he stood for. I think that this society is a good and decent society founded with inalienable rights, informed by a genius constitution, and that to be an American is to accept that foundation. The researchers and the witnesses who stood up for what is right are truly profiles in courage.